Hi everyone, I'm Sasha Morel. I'm a junior at Plano West Senior High School. I've been doing Extemp for quite a while now. I'm fifth in Texas, so that's all right. I've qualified to Nats, am currently district champion. Um, qual to ETOC, qual to the TOC, won ASU. So I know my stuff, but this isn't about me. This is about the background in Extemp, right? So this is how to Extemp like a college student, mastering the background taught by a high school student. That doesn't mean you should discredit what I'm saying. It just means like the title isn't about me. So here's what we're going to be going through. By the way, highly recommend you take notes, because this, ooh, we have a spectator that came late. Not a big deal. I highly recommend you guys take notes. I think it definitely helps process the information better, helps you get it down more. And like when people gave me lectures, I always took notes, and look where I am now. So there's four parts. Rethinking extemp, right? We're gonna jumble what you think of extemp is and make it a little bit more about what it really is. Second, we're gonna learn to analyze our questions so we can make backgrounds that matter. Third, we're gonna get a hang of style, right? What can we do to make our background a little bit more oomph? Sure. And then fourth, we're gonna look at some types of questions and how we can change our backgrounds and our speeches to work around them. Whoa, before we begin, this lecture will be available on Discord, on the YouTube, and if you have any questions, y'all can email me at sasha.morel.2007@gmail.com. I should have made myself a shorter email. First, rethinking extemp. So this part's basically more about explaining what extemp really is. So when we're going down to like actually creating and answering questions and making backgrounds, we have a better idea of what we should be doing. Extemp is a college essay. Extemp is based off the college activity of writing a bunch of essays, but like political short form essays, right? So if you're in like a poli sci class or an econ class, you're gonna get a prompt and then 30 minutes to write an essay answering that prompt, right? And so that's what Extemp is originally based off of. So you can blame college students for making your life hell when your coach decides to throw you an Extemp. But that also means that we kind of understand how we should view extemp, right? If extemp is supposed to be like a college essay, then we kind of should be answering it like an essay, right? So if you're in any AP classes, a lot of this should be a little bit second nature to you, but we're gonna get the hang of it. Um, Also, by the way, extemp apparently a cheat code for when you're in college. I got a couple friends on the UT speech team, and they're like, "Yeah, extemp was basically all I do in my poli sci class now." So, um, Extemp is now less focused on being scholarly. Not a big deal. I don't really mind. Being funny and focusing on that wow factor is really good because it's still speech and debate, right? It's not here's an essay, but we need to learn how to mix speech and debate with the original roots of extemp, right? And so we're kind of forgetting to analyze, introduce a topic, and create an informational narrative when we're in that background, kind of because nowadays students are often rewarded for trying to be super funny and spending 40 seconds of their background telling a joke instead of really giving us the topic, right? That doesn't mean cut out your AGDs, but like we got to get the background back in. So, how do we analyze a question, right? You kind of have an idea of what extemp used to be, and you kind of understand that when you give an extemp speech, you're answering a question like an essay. But how do we know how to make what to make the essay look like? How do we know how our backgrounds and our intros should reflect our question? Well, first, we have to analyze a question, right? McKinley Paltzik just released a really good segment on this on the NSDA website, but I'm going to take it up a notch because I kind of view it this way, and this is what many extempers do. And I feel like this is something that isn't taught very often at like the high school level of extemp, but is really common in college extemp. So how do we view an extemp question? Three ways, analytically, right? The question's asking you, how does one thing affect another? How does X affect Y? Second, culturally, right? You have to ask what the question demands that you recognize in terms of like how it affects our society, right? No one's gonna ask you a question if it doesn't matter. And like, I'm sorry, a lot of kids will like look at a question and be like, this is really stupid. If someone wrote a question about it, it's because it's affecting people's lives. Like one time I got a question like, what's up with the price of eggs? Yeah, no one really cares about eggs, but people care about how much money they're spending on their groceries. So like we have to understand how this question is culturally pressing us. And then third, personally, right? As an extemp scholar, right? As someone who does extemp, am I motivated to answer this question? Am I drawn to this question? Like, for example, I am of Russian descent. So I know a lot about the war in Russia and Ukraine. And like that situation is something that I'm really heavily involved in because of the situation I'm in. So personally, right? Do I feel connected to this topic? There's going to be times where you draw three questions, you're like, wow, I couldn't care about each of these. But you still have to ask yourself, which ones do you think affect me the most? And am I drawn to asking these? So remember, three internal questions that we have to ask before we even choose a question. Analytically, what is it? Second, culturally, right? What does it demand of our society? And third, do I want to answer this question? Because if you don't want to answer the question and you pick it, you're in for a really rough ride. All right, analysis, the biggest part of extemp, right? This is what drops someone from semis to finals at a big tournament. Because let's be real, everyone can learn to speak really well. But if you can't learn to analyze your extemp questions, then you're not going to make it very far in out rounds, right? What I do and what I teach is to remember your science classes. So like in the chat, tell me what science classes have we taken in the past, right? Like any AP classes, what science have we been in? Just like kind of to get a feel of like what our level of like knowledge is. Because if I have a lot of middle schoolers, then I have to go and really explain this. But if we have high school tutors, chem honors, right? Cool. All right, I'm gonna take AP Chem, AP Physics, Bio, and Chem honors. So, right, cool, right? We have a good idea of like what happens in science classes. So in science class, when they ask you about the independent variable and dependent variable, we should have a decent idea of what that is, right? The IV is what we're changing in a speech, and the DV is what changes, like how is it changing, right? And that's what extemp is. Like going back to like the whole college part of extemp, when you write a college essay, you have to analyze how X affects Y. And so the biggest thing that we need to do as soon as we get an extemps question is sit our butts down at the table and think, what is this question changing, or what changed in the question, and how did it affect a variable, right? So you have your IV and your DV. And like this is something that should be really common as you go through high school and you write high school essays and papers, because that's virtually what everything is always asking you to do, right? And so we have to find out what the IV and DV is. So we're going to do a little exercise here. This is a tricky extemp question. And I want everyone in the chat to tell me what the IV and the DV is. Following the recent democracy summit, will South Korea become a model for Southeast Asian nations? So like overall, what's new, or what the IV, what's the DV? I'm working your brains a little bit here. So the IV, remember, the independent variable is what we're changing in the question, and the DV is what it's influencing, right? So as an extemp, right, in an extemp, we have to say this IV changed the DV. Cool. Yeah, IV is the Democracy Summit. I thought that one was yeah, cool. I really like how what Rohan, you said South Korea's image, right? When I was told to answer this question, my IV, like my independent variable, was South Korea is a new model of democracy. But that's basically right. What did they change at the Democracy Summit? Like what did they advertise and what's their image? The DV is a little trickier in this question. And that's why I'm kind of like trying to test y'all here. Because remember, it's a how will question. Will South Korea become a model for Southeast nations? So when some of us in the chat said South Korea modeling, sure. And like one of us wrote the model for Southeast Asian nations. But will South Korea become a model doesn't necessarily mean that countries will adopt that system of democracy, right? Just because you're modeling after something doesn't mean that it's going to end up being that. So I think the DV here, it's a little tricky, but it's the willingness for other countries to go and like use South Korea's model, right? It's not the ability or will they end up having the same system, but it's the willingness to. And I think that's something that you can definitely identify in your background to make the rest of your speech easier. Because let's say you don't do that and your judge is sitting there thinking, so tell me how Hong Kong, the least democratic part of Asia, is going to suddenly do this, right? First of all, no, they're not. But you're asking for the country's willingness to model, right? I think that's something that's tricky, but that's the kind of thing that you need to do. So good job, everyone. The recent democracy summit is the IV, and then the DV is the willingness for Southeast Asian nations to model South Korea. Oh, it's not as simple as just highlighting, right? So this is kind of what I went over. I kind of jumped the gun here, right? You can't just go into your question and highlight, this is the IV, this is the DV, right? You can't just go here and be like, it's in the question. You're gonna have to think a little harder for a lot of questions, right? So like I wrote here, right? The IV isn't the summit because, right, if you look at the question here and you just see, okay, the word democracy summit is in there, that's your independent variable, I guess. But in reality, the independent variable is Korea's new brand of democracy because that's what's changing. And then your DV, right? You're not asking if Southeast Asian nations will adopt the model, but their willingness to. So like, remember, you can go and like look at the question and be like, the words are there, but you have to think past the words. It's difficult. And I'll be honest, as an extemper, you never get this right. You never do. And then you have a judge who is like, a poli-sci major at a university, or you have a judge who's, a writer for the New York Times, and they're like, dude, what the are you talking about? But the more that we practice with extemp questions and the more comfortable we get with, okay, this is what they're asking, but behind that, here's the independent variable that's changing, and here's the dependent variable that's influenced, we can create a more solid, a more scientific approach at creating an extemp speech. All right, let's get back on track here. We love South Korea, but we can't talk about them all day. The IV and DV must be explained in your background. And although it seems like that's a lot to go through, it's the most important part of setting up your speech. First of all, if you explain what the IV and DV are, you're already doing the background's job. You're doing the who, what, when, where, and why, right? And I'm sure you're going to go and ask your coach, what needs to be in my background? And they're going to be like, oh, you have to explain the who, what's, when's, where's, and why's. If you explain what the two things that happen in your speech are, you're doing that already. Second, it allows you to immediately know what you're going to talk about in the rest of your speech. Because if you're sitting there like, South Korea Democracy Summit, model for democracy, and you're like thinking about all these other things, and in your background, you're like, oh, this happened in Cambodia, this happened in Laos, this happened in Thailand, and like, blah, blah, blah. South Korea used to do this, but they did this, and blah, blah, blah. And like, that's a lot of great information, but not necessarily important to your speech. And so what you're doing is that you're narrowing down your focus just so your analysis later gets really sharp and clear. Third, you're doing it for your audience. Remember, extemp is not about you, but about what your judge thinks of you. And so by making it easy for your audience to understand what your speech is about, they comprehend the analysis a lot better. And then finally, it leaves out the clutter, right? Let's be real here. when you start talking about all of this other BS that's happening in the world and not about what your speech is asking, you clutter up what could be really simple. And that leaves your judge thinking, okay, you mentioned this in your background, but I didn't hear this in the rest of your speech. Or what the heck does blank have to do with blank when your question's about blank? You get the point. By finding the independent variable and dependent variable, we create a perfect strategy for a great speech. The background in an extemp speech is really, really, really important, and it will be the difference between the one and the three. Master Uguay said that, or I said that. Regardless, I'm gonna be really dead ass with y'all. When it comes down to securing a good rank, being a great speaker and having good analysis is awesome. But if you want to go and watch a national final speech, the difference between the one and the three and like the two and the four is oftentimes what they did in the background. For example, right? I think one of the best backgrounds of all time is when Gabe Bow in his speech went and Gabe Bow last national final was a great person. Not that he's not anymore, but he's no longer on the circuit. But he gave an awesome background and it was really touching. But he kind of failed to explain who the actors were. And so I got a lot of comments from judges being like, I felt a little lost. The national champion, McKinley Paltzik, right? I feel like I've mentioned her a lot, but what she did is that she really quickly listed basically this is happening, and this is kind of why it matters in the world. And so we got to ask today's question. And like that level of like background analysis before you even get into your speech immediately made judges think, all right, she's going to be top half of my room. So here is Justin Cooper's 2018 college national final speech. And what I'm going to have you do is just listen to how he sets up a background. College Extemp's a little different, but he does it really well.
Last month, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull to discuss India potentially joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a free trade agreement amongst many nations like Japan, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and several Southeast Asian nations like Malaysia and Vietnam. However, as the New York Times explains on March 15, 2018, Modi showed up late to the meeting because, and I quote, "It's too emotional after watching Titanic for the first time." That's like India's chance for free trade agreement. That's hit an iceberg. At the same time, as the Wall Street Journal explains on April 2nd, 2018, there's another threat on the rise in Asia. China, as their growing economic and political hegemony has caused much institutional fear amongst many nations, some of which are TPP member states. Now, India has long served as a check on China's increasing influence in the region. And as the East-West Institute for Asian Policy Research articulates on March 31st, 2018, by allowing India to join the TPP, it may actually allow India to serve as an even better check against China's growing influence in the region. Making it critical that we ask ourselves today's question. Should the TPP target India for membership to counter Chinese hegemony in Asia?
Boom, right? Immediately, he blew away everyone's mind because when he got to the question, which by the way, Extemp in college, they don't hear your question until you say it, right? They were like, I already know what all this is. And I promise you, all of those judges had no idea what the TPP was before they entered that round. But when you look at Justin's background, he splits it into two parts. First, here's the TPP. Second, here's China's influence. And then it's pretty important. But when he gets to the question, you already know what all of those things are, so you don't have to do any explaining later. And immediately, he tells you how it operates, what China's influence is. So when we get to the actual points, we know that the dependent variable is already China's hegemonic economic influence, right? And we know exactly what that looks like. So when we explain how it changes because of allowing India in, we can paint a world from his background. And then when he tells you how it changes, perfect. Like it's perfect, right? Instead of having to go on your points and be like, China does this. And so if they allow, India to come in, then here's how it's going to look, right? We already know what China like how China changed the world economically from his background. We already know what the TPP does. It's and he doesn't need to talk about India's influence, even though it's nice to know. That's not what the question's asking, right? Once again, he uses IVDV strategy to give you the perfect background. Now we're gonna get a hang of style, right? So you should already know how to construct the background. We've already kind of been through the idea of like how to make or how to find our like 2 or 3 parts of the background. So now how do we make it sound good? Because if you sound good, you rank good. So what makes a good background great? Paint a picture. This was like my biggest issue in my first year of Extemp. Being descriptive turns your analysis into something tangible that your audience can see and understand. You're eliciting your audience members' different senses. Because instead of giving them like an essay lecture about, let's say, for example, I don't know, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, right? Instead of giving them a lecture about how Armenia and Azerbaijan are destroying this separatist movement, right? By painting a picture and saying, Azerbaijani military forces have gone in, cut down phone wires, imprisoned people, and most importantly, have taken the lives through gunfire of just basic innocent humans. You go from explaining, okay, there's a conflict in there, to, wow, this is what it really looks like. And so you still answer the same basic question of like, what is Azerbaijani's fault in? Like, you're still basically like in a scenario, here's the independent variable, like Azerbaijani's military onslaught of like the separatist movement, right? If that's your independent variable, that's great. But now you've described it to me in a way that makes your audience go, holy shit. And like in their mind, in their eyes, they're seeing this like small place that's being destroyed by military forces, and you really kick it up a notch. Let's see just how big of a difference it makes. The CDC on January 8th explains that minorities often receive a lower standard of care in the medical sector, which causes a racial disparity in the most important part of their lives. Is that wrong? No. If you gave that to me, I'd be like, okay, you're right. Awesome. Let's get to the next part. The CDC on January 8th explained that minorities receive a lower standard of care, often receiving wrong diagnoses, being told that their pain is being overblown, and not being able to see the doctor in the first place. Y'all just said the same 2 things, but speaker one's getting my 2 in this room because speaker number 2 just went in and said, hey, I said the same thing that he did, but this is what it really looks like. You're opening the door so your judge can understand the world that you're painting. And so I think that's the biggest thing that, especially here in Texas, where we're really focused on the nitty gritty, gets left out. And so I think as extempers, when you're making your background, being descriptive is super, super important. Use your face. I was like terrible at this. And I also have like an RBF, so not helping. I'm gonna give you one tip right now. Use your eyebrows. In my TFA final, at this final of like Texas state final, right? My judge went, I'm hearing a really happy person with the voice of a guy who couldn't care less, or with the face of a guy who couldn't care less. Because I can sound really, really interested in something, and I can even tell you that I'm interested in something. But if my face looked like this, my judge doesn't know that I care. So the biggest thing that you can do is use your eyebrows. If you're mad at something, furrow your eyebrows inwards. If you're happy at something, open up your eyebrows. If you're questioning, you can go like this. But using your eyebrows and shifting them up or down literally tells your judges non-verbally how they should be feeling about your speech. And like, there's not much you can change about your body. There's not much that you can use to express, right? You're not going to start doing cartwheels and go like this with your arms, right? But what you can do is use your face, and your eyebrows is the easiest way to do that. So like, I'm not going to ask you guys to turn your cameras on because that's kind of silly. And I don't feel like I don't think y'all are going to do that. But like next time you guys give a speech and you say something really serious, furrow your eyebrows. And when you say something really positive or really good, lift them up. And I promise you, that's the difference between a 1 and a 2 in a room as well. The last part of my lecture, this is like super, super critical types of questions. If you do extemp for more than one tournament, you're going to see a variety of questions that have different independent variables and different dependent variables. But if you can learn what the questions, like how questions operate, you can immediately know what the dependent variable is, so you can like better analyze questions. So here are some common question types, like, and their and what their dependent variables are going to be. Obviously, like the subject of the question changes, but by kind of understanding, hey, it's a can question, here's what I need to understand. Like, here's what I'm solving for. This is already knowing what's under the lines when you read an extemp or when you read a question. Can Joe Biden win another election? It's the possibility of, right? Is it possible? And like, so your dependent variable is the possibility for Joe Biden to win another election, right? Is Joe Biden going to win another election? It's the current status of. If Joe Biden, like the DV is Joe Biden's ability to win an election, right? And the current status of it. You're basically, the question's asking you, if Joe Biden continues to do what he's going to do, will he win an election, right? So it's the current status of something. Should, the benefits of, right? Should Joe Biden win another election? Your dependent variable is like the benefits of Joe Biden, right? Winning that election, right? Will Joe Biden win another election? The willingness to win another election. That one's pretty difficult because will and can are similar but different. Can is it possible? Is the current status of, and will is the willingness to, which I guess is hard to understand, but will questions are asking you in the future, is Joe Biden going to win that election? Not now. Is currently, will Joe Biden win the election? Or is Joe Biden is Joe Biden winning the election? Will Joe Biden win the election is, in the future, after everything's transpired, is Joe Biden on top? So there's differences between can, is, and will, although they're really similar. And when you can like figure out those differences, you can read under the lines of an extemp question. Ooh. This is the most difficult part of extemp. And this is like something that as senior extempers, as like varsity extempers, you're going to start to hit at big tournaments. And these questions will kill someone if you don't understand what they're like. And the first one's a hypothetical, right? If you've never hit a hypothetical, they give you a fake scenario and ask you to like answer something, right? For example, I think the latest EIF hypo, I think it's the one I wrote. We can go plug. You know me, I'm always going to plug my work, but I'm also going to plug the greatest speech and debate website. Oh, this is Rohan's, not mine. After one of Japan's anime shoguns come to life, they dissolve the government, return to a traditional shogunate, and reinstitute Japanese isolationism. What will the effect of Japan's complete halt, or what will be the effect of Japan's complete halt to military exports? Right? So, first, we have to figure out what the real question is. Because once we do that, then we're chill. I think Rohan made it pretty easy, right? So it's like Japan reinstitutes isolationism. What will be the effect of Japan's complete halt to military exports? And so, the question is, will Japanese isolationism, or what will be the effect of Japan's isolationism to military exports? Actually, this is a tough question because I think Japanese isolationism is a red herring, right? This is really just a question. What will be the effect of Japan's complete halt to military exports, right? And like the fact that it's a will question allows us to go back and be like, in the future, you know, what is going to happen, right? So is the current status and will is the future status, right? So when Rohan asks us, what will be the effect of Japan's complete halt to military exports? We know that we're looking for in 6 months, in a year, how does that affect us, right? So our independent variable is the complete halt to military exports because that's what's changing. And the DV is the effect, which is going to be whatever services depend on military exports, right? That's why we can't just go and highlight the question and be like, here's the DV. You have to think, who does Japan export military services to? What specific countries, what specific war efforts do they rely on, right? And the second tip I can give you is to not get carried away in the hypo. I have seen so many extempers, including myself, go and get a hypo question that's really silly. Like, I think I got a hypo that like Donald Trump shot Joe Biden, right? And like the question was like, will Trump still get reelected, right? And so the question is like, the question's silly. It's fun, and your audience will get a laugh just when you read the question. But if I spend my entire background talking about, Donald Trump's gonna do this, and oh, he shoots Joe Biden, haha, silly, right? It cuts away time that you can use because you're trying to structure your speech well, but it also like isn't anything that like our judges can use to analyze the speech. No one's gonna sit there and be like, wow. Or I'll answer your question in a second, son. But like, no one's gonna sit there and be like, wow, he's really giving me something that I didn't know. Because it's in the question, right? And you're wasting your time by focusing on it. On what circuits are these hypo questions present? Haven't encountered them yet. So it's usually pretty natcirc. Harvard finals is always a hypo. Capital City round robin is always a hypo final. I think there's a round at Yale that's a final, or that's a hypo. I've got to say, I don't think ASU finals was a hypo, but they're pretty, yeah, they're really, really common on like national circuit tournaments because they're a step above a regular extemp question. Yeah, thanks, Ron. The next question that we need to be afraid of is a triad, which is like the killer question in my opinion, right? Basically, there's three actors. So like I got a triad question at Cap City at the round robin, and they were like, it was like, how will the new military plan between the Philippines and Thailand affect China's expansion into the South China Sea? Now, my strategy is always to group actors together. And so here it was really easy. It was like served on a dinner platter, right? You group Thailand and the Philippines, and then you have a 2v1 type beat and you're chilling, right? And then it's a regular extemp question. But let's say you get a peace brokerage question. Like, is the United States in a good position to broker peace between, Israel and Hamas? Now you have to explain about the United States, Israel, and Hamas, right? And it becomes difficult to group. However, if it's not already grouped for you, maybe you can put the US and Israel, right, together a little bit. Maybe in your background, you explain that the United States has the ability to influence, military politics. It's now become a question of whether the United States can finally adapt to Gaza's new governmental structures, right? Or Hamas's governmental powers. So when you group it together, you make it a little easier for you to do analysis later because it just basically becomes a regular extemp speech. That's the lecture. I know it's probably a bit of a shorter one, but I'll be real, there's only so much I can talk about for the extemp background. In terms of making your extemp better, I think it's the biggest step. This is literally the information that took me from I didn't even break at state last year at TFA State. But this year I like went into the final round, and that's because like I could take this background and really present a speech that was intellectually strong, intellectually capable, and one that was able to define what the rest of my speech would look like. So I'm gonna act like now is the time for questions. I want you to flood the chat with questions. So with the background, how long is the intro going to be? Pushing over a minute. So the rule of thumb is your question, you want to ask the question around a minute. So if you can ask the question at a minute 10, that's completely fine, right? What I can, offer as like advice, keep your attention getters really short. And that way, more time for the background, right? And when you keep your AGDs short and punchy, it makes your audience sit there and think, right? You're not dragging it out. It's boom. But as the New York Times explains, this issue isn't just hers, but affects over 5 million people in the United States. And then, so like short AGD, your background's 45 seconds to 50 seconds. You have your statement of significance. So like, and it's when considering, and then you have your question around a minute. So yeah, your intro overall is like a minute 30, but you want to ask the question around that minute mark. Any other questions from y'all? I know y'all have been a great audience because if y'all weren't a good audience, you guys would ruin my lecture. And if I ruined the lecture, it was my fault. So please ask away. I don't see anything coming out of y'all. So I'm probably gonna end it here. But if you guys do have any questions later on, maybe you're struggling with the whole IVDV situation. Maybe you're like, man, I don't know how to furrow my eyebrows. You guys can hit me up with my email. It's right there. Add me on Discord. I do private sessions on Discord, so y'all can reach me there. And you guys can always hit me up on Instagram. Go shoot me a follow. Also, kind of want to thank SlidesGo, like greatest slide making tool in the world. They provided like this entire like slide layout. Is the analytical voice ever necessary? What do you mean by that? Like the way like you change your voice? Or like the analysis? No. Okay. You never want to sound like a news anchor. And I think that's one of the biggest things that like extempers struggle with. They struggle with being really like passionate and not being passionate enough, right? You have to find this Goldilocks zone. So like when I'm giving an extemp speech, I'm going to talk basically like I talk myself, but maybe I'm going to add a little bit more robustness in the way I say words. That way they punch a little bit harder, right? So you never want to have a monotone like news voice, because the moment your judges hear, as the New York Times explains on March 5th of 2023, blah 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 blah, this is really bad. Your judge is going to be dead asleep in their chair, and you're getting a 4, 5, or 6. Should you ever have more than one source in your background? I recommend 1 to 2 sources. I think you should have a source for your independent variable and your dependent variable, but it's not necessary, right? Always have at least one. But if it's something if you have a question like, I don't know, how will Kari Lake's friendly relationship with Donald Trump, or how can Kari Lake use her friendly relationship with Donald Trump to increase funding for her like campaign, right? You don't really need a source to explain that Kari Lake has had relations with Trump in the past. You can go like, ever since 2016, like Arizona Senator candidate Kari Lake has been consistently running with Donald Trump's support. In fact, they've been seen together multiple times and have collaborated on X projects. Yet, their friendly situation can be a massive aid to her struggling campaign, as the New York Times explains on March 5th, right? She has half she only has roughly $4 million in the bank to help aid her campaign. But compared to Ruben Gallegos, her running counterpart, he has roughly 10 million. putting her at not only a serious disadvantage, but making it incapable for her to run in many cities, provide campaigns that help her constituents, and most importantly, win the election. So you see, I didn't need a source for my first point, but I definitely needed one for my second. Let's say I have a question asking which candidate is more likely to win whatever. I pick candidate B. Should I frame my background objectively, still, or favor candidate B, or does it not matter? I think your background should always be objective. I think when you have election questions, like who will win X election, you have to explain who both are, because these are tough questions. But when you're answering this extemp question, right, because there's not really a flat out independent variable or dependent variable, you have to kind of construct that, right? You're immediately going to say, well, let's say Trump versus Biden, right? You say you say Biden's going to win. So your dependent variable is Biden's chance of winning, right? And then you have to create an independent variable, such as like, so like you say yes, or like you say Biden's going to win, you know, because he has no legal issues, right? And so his legal issues or like the lack of legal issues becomes your independent variable, and then Biden becomes your DV. However, that still means you have to explain both, right? So if your speech is going to be about legal issues, right? You go in your background and you're like, Trump has X amount of legal issues, but as the Wall Street Journal explains, Biden's had a pretty clean slate, which he has not. We all know that. We all know Biden, just like every politician, loves to lie and cheat and steal. But you have to create your independent variable, and then you have to still explain it in the background. You don't lose objectiveness by doing that. Remember, you just still have to address both your IV and your DV. How does prep for extemp work? So 30 minutes, right? You sit in a room for 30 minutes, and in those 30 minutes, you have your question. And then you have to prep out a speech in probably like 15 minutes, and then practice for another 15 minutes before you get in the room. If you're wondering how to get into like learning prepping extemp, Waleed Hader has a really, really good lecture on the EIF YouTube channel, and that's all intro to extemp. So like, I'm sorry that Mohammed, this lecture was probably not designed for like learning how to do extemp, but now that you have this new view, you can watch Waleed's lecture, learn all about how to get into extemp, and then use these like extra analytical tips to get better. But yeah, basically 30 minutes in a room, you have a question, you prepare a speech on the question and give it. But like if you're asking more about like how it works, you'll be sitting down and they'll call up your speaker, your like speaker number 3, and then you'll go up, pick the question out of an envelope, and go back to your seat and start prepping. Any other questions? Did I miss anything? No. How do you prep a solution question? Like a solution question like, is blank the solution for blank? Oh, what should Joe Biden do, or how should the National Transportation Security Board prevent another Baltimore blunder? So a should question. So remember, uh, should is the benefits of, right? So your DV is going to be, well, like if should X do about X, your dependent variable is that second X, right? How can the NTSB prevent another Baltimore blunder? Your X is your DV is preventing another Baltimore blunder, and then you have to create the independent variable, which is your solution. So like your independent variable is your solution, and your dependent variable is how it prevents something or solves the issue, right? So like for those type of solution questions, you probably need to create an independent variable and then in your DV explain how it solves. Does that kind of answer your question? All right, cool. Any other questions before we wrap up today's lecture? All right, well, that's going to conclude mastering the background, extemping like a college student, taught by a high schooler. Please, guys, remember, I want to get. Please, guys, remember that extemp is a game, debate is a game. You do this for fun. But also remember that everything you say has a real life impact. Your job is to impact the life of your judge for the better, right? And so the way that you can impact their lives is by giving them good speeches, and good extemp speeches start with the background. So thank y'all so much for coming. Once again, please hit me up if you guys have questions. I'll see y'all around. I'm always in EIF doing stuff, so it was great having a lecture with y'all. Bye, guys.